In the wake of a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, a wave of fear and suspicion swept across the United States, altering the lives of thousands of Japanese American families forever. February 19, 1942, marked the beginning of one of the most controversial and painful chapters in American history, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Under the guise of national security, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and communities, finding themselves confined in desolate internment camps scattered across the United States. But behind the barbed wire and watchtowers, there are stories of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of those who lived through these dark times. This is the untold story of the Japanese American internment, a stark reminder of the cost of fear and prejudice, and a call to never forget the lessons of our past. Join us here at the Illuminating the Shadows of American History channel as we delve into the history, the heartache, and the enduring legacy of the internment camps through the voices of those who experienced it firsthand and the scholars who have dedicated their lives to ensuring such injustices are never repeated. So welcome to our journey into a pivotal moment in American history. Now let's explore this event together. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II stands as one of the most significant violations of civil liberties in American history. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan on December 7, 1941, the United States government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. This order authorized the forced removal and incarceration of individuals of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast, encompassing both American citizens and resident aliens. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens, were uprooted from their homes and placed in internment camps scattered across desolate areas of the United States. This action was justified by the government as a necessary measure for national security, predicated on the fear of espionage and sabotage. However, it was a decision that lacked concrete evidence and was fueled by racial prejudice and wartime hysteria. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor not only propelled the United States into World War II, but also triggered a wave of national panic and insecurity. This event significantly altered the perception of Japanese Americans within American society. Despite their established communities and contributions to American life, they were suddenly viewed with suspicion and fear. The prevailing racism of the time, combined with the shock of the attack, led to the widespread belief that individuals of Japanese descent, regardless of their citizenship, status, or loyalty to the United States, posed a potential threat to national security. This fear was amplified by sensationalist media, discriminatory policies, and public opinion, which collectively painted all Japanese Americans as potential enemies within. The government's response, culminating in the internment, was a manifestation of these fears, enacted despite a lack of evidence to support the perceived threat. This video aims to shed light on a dark chapter of American history, one that is often overlooked or misunderstood. Through exploring the history and personal experiences of those who lived through the internment of Japanese Americans, we seek to provide a comprehensive understanding of the events and their profound impact on individuals, families, and communities. The narrative of internment is not only a story of injustice and loss, but also one of resilience, courage, and the enduring spirit of the Japanese American community. By examining the legacy of the internment camps, including the redress movement and the ongoing efforts to remember and learn from this experience, This video endeavors to honor the memories of those affected and to educate a new generation. The ultimate goal is to foster a more informed and empathetic understanding of our shared history, highlighting the importance of vigilance against the forces of fear and prejudice to ensure that such injustices are never repeated. The history of Japanese immigration to the United States began in the late 19th century, marked by the arrival of the first known Japanese immigrant, a fisherman named Manjiro Nakahama, in 1843, and the more significant wave of immigrants who started arriving in the 1880s. These early immigrants, known as Issei or first generation, sought new opportunities and a better life away from the economic hardships and social restrictions of Meiji-era Japan. They initially found work in agriculture, railroads, and fisheries, and despite facing legal and social hurdles, they began to establish vibrant communities, particularly on the west coast of the United States. By the early 20th century, these Japanese American communities had grown significantly, with the establishment of businesses, schools, and religious institutions that reflected a blend of Japanese traditions and American culture. The Nisei, or second generation, American-born children of the Issei, began to navigate the complexities of their dual heritage, contributing to both their local economies and the broader societal fabric. However, Japanese immigrants and their descendants faced significant legal discrimination. Laws such as the Alien Land Laws of the early 1900s prohibited them from owning land and property in several states. The 1924 Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, effectively banned all immigration from Japan, reflecting the nativist and exclusionary attitudes of the time towards Asians. These legal barriers, coupled with widespread societal prejudice, set the stage for the challenges Japanese Americans would face during World War II. The political and social climate of the United States in the decades leading up to World War II was marked by a complex mix of isolationism, economic depression, and a rise in nativist sentiments. Japanese Americans, like other Asian communities, were often viewed with suspicion and faced systemic racism. This prejudice was not only social, but also institutionalized through laws that discriminated against them based on their race and nationality. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, dramatically shifted the national mood and perception of Japanese Americans. The surprise military strike by the Empire of Japan against the United States led to an immediate and overwhelming response from the American public and government, with the United States declaring war on Japan the following day. In the wake of the attack, fear and paranoia about national security became widespread, and Japanese Americans were unfairly targeted as potential saboteurs or spies, despite a lack of evidence to support such accusations. This suspicion was fueled by long-standing racial prejudices and was exacerbated by the government and media's portrayal of the threat. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, began rounding up Japanese community leaders and individuals deemed a threat on the very night of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the U.S. government soon took broader actions that would lead to the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. The culmination of these prejudices and the wartime hysteria following Pearl Harbor set the stage for Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced removal and internment of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. This order, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in February 1942, was justified on the grounds of military necessity, but has since been recognized as a grave injustice, influenced by racial prejudice rather than by proven security risk. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is a stark reminder of the dangers of allowing fear, prejudice, and unfounded suspicions to override the principles of justice and civil liberties. The experiences of the Japanese American community before and during the war underscore the importance of vigilance against racial discrimination and the need to protect the rights of all individuals, especially in times of national crisis. On February 19, 1942, amidst the heightened tensions and fears following the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This pivotal decree would lead to one of the most significant violations of civil liberties in American history, affecting tens of thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II. Executive Order 9066 granted the U.S. military the authority to exclude any persons from designated areas as a measure of national security and military necessity. While the order did not specify any particular group, its implementation effectively targeted the Japanese American community. The broad powers given by the order allowed the military to designate vast swaths of the West Coast as military zones from which any person could be removed and excluded. This order was rooted in the belief that Japanese Americans posed a potential espionage or sabotage threat, despite a lack of concrete evidence to support such claims. The sweeping authority granted by Executive Order 9066 was used to justify the forced removal and subsequent incarceration of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. Following the issuance of Executive Order 9066, the Western Defense Command, led by General John L. DeWitt, began the process of designating military areas from which Japanese Americans would be excluded. The West Coast of the United States was divided into military areas number 1 and number 2, with area number 1 covering California, the western portions of Oregon and Washington, and southern Arizona. The military then issued a series of civilian exclusion orders, which mandated the removal of Japanese Americans from these areas. The forced relocation process began in the spring of 1942, with families given only days to settle their affairs, dispose of their properties, and report to assembly centers. These were often makeshift facilities such as racetracks and fairgrounds, where they lived under harsh conditions before being moved again to more permanent internment camps known as relocation centers. These camps were scattered across isolated areas in the interior West, including places like Manzanar in California, Minidoka in Idaho, and Hart Mountain in Wyoming. The internment camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, and the internees lived in overcrowded barracks with inadequate facilities. Despite the harsh conditions, Japanese Americans established communities within these camps, setting up schools, farms, and newspapers, and striving to maintain a sense of normalcy amid their unjust imprisonment. The decision to issue Executive Order 9066 and the subsequent actions taken under its authority were later acknowledged by the U.S. government as grave injustices driven by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. In 1988, the U.S. government formally apologized to the surviving Japanese Americans who were interned through the Civil Liberties Act, which recognized the injustice of the internment, provided reparations to living survivors, and established an educational fund to help prevent such injustices from happening again. The internment camps, officially called relocation centers, were hastily constructed in desolate, remote areas of the country. The living conditions within these camps were harsh and challenging, with internees facing both physical and emotional hardships. Barracks were crudely built, offering little insulation against the extreme temperatures, scorching heat in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. Families were crowded into single rooms with minimal privacy and inadequate facilities. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, a constant reminder of the unjust imprisonment of Japanese Americans. Food shortages were common, and the meals provided were often insufficient and not suited to the dietary habits of the internees. Medical facilities and services were limited, leading to health issues among the camp population. Despite these conditions, Japanese Americans sought to create a sense of normalcy, establishing schools for children, organizing religious services, and forming community groups. The human impact of internment is best understood through the personal stories of those who lived through it. One poignant account comes from George Takei, who was interned as a child with his family. Takei, later famous as an actor and activist, has spoken extensively about the experience, highlighting the confusion and fear he felt as a child, the strength of his parents, and the lasting impact of internment on his life. For those who don't know, Mr. Takei played Mr. Sulu in the original Star Trek series from the 1960s. Another story is that of Yuri Koshiyama, a human rights activist who was interned at Jerome Relocation Center in Arkansas. Koshiyama's experiences in the camp shaped her lifelong commitment to civil rights, illustrating how the internment experience motivated some to fight against injustice for the rest of their lives. These personal narratives underscore the resilience of the human spirit and the profound impact of the internment on individuals and families. They also serve as a reminder of the injustices endured by Japanese Americans during this dark chapter of American history. Despite the unjust circumstances of their internment, Japanese Americans made concerted efforts to maintain dignity, build community, and express their patriotism. Within the camps, internees organized educational classes, cultural events, and religious services. They established newspapers, sports leagues, and art classes, creating a vibrant community life under difficult circumstances. One remarkable aspect of the internment experience was the patriotism displayed by many Japanese Americans. Despite facing discrimination and loss of rights, thousands of young men from the camps volunteered to serve in the U.S. military, forming the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which became one of the most decorated units for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military. The valor and loyalty of these soldiers helped to challenge the stereotypes and prejudices against Japanese Americans. The efforts to maintain dignity and community cohesion, alongside the display of patriotism, highlight the complexity of the Japanese American experience during World War II. These actions were not only a means of survival, but also a powerful statement against the injustice of their internment. The legacy of the internment camps and the resilience of those who were imprisoned continues to resonate, serving as a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II faced several legal challenges, culminating in significant Supreme Court cases that tested the limits of civil liberties in times of national crisis. Among these, Korematsu versus United States from 1944 stands out as a landmark case. Fred Korematsu, an American citizen of Japanese descent, was arrested and convicted for failing to comply with the order to report to an internment camp. Korematsu's case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where he argued that Executive Order 9066 and the internment of Japanese Americans were unconstitutional. In a controversial 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction, ruling that the need to protect against espionage outweighed Korematsu's right. Justice Hugo Black, writing for the majority, stated that the exclusion orders were not based on racial discrimination, but on military necessity. This decision has been heavily criticized in subsequent years for its endorsement of racial discrimination under the guise of national security. In 1983, Korematsu's conviction was formally vacated by a federal court in a coram nobis case, acknowledging the injustice of the internment orders and the government's misconduct in presenting its case during the war. Other significant cases related to the internment include Hirabayashi versus United States from 1943 and Ex parte Endo from 1944. Gordon Hirabayashi, a university student, challenged the curfew and exclusion orders on constitutional grounds, but the Supreme Court upheld the government's actions, citing wartime necessity. However, in Ex parte Endo, the court unanimously ruled that the government could not continue to detain a loyal American citizen, Mitsuye Endo, against her will, leading to the eventual release of Japanese Americans from the internment camps before the war's end. Despite the internment of their families and communities, many Japanese Americans served valiantly in the U.S. military during World War II. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, is particularly notable for its extraordinary bravery and the high number of decorations it received. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, including the 100th Infantry Battalion, originally a separate unit but later integrated into the 442nd, was activated in 1943 and fought in the European theater. The unit's motto, quote, "Go for broke," unquote, reflected their willingness to risk everything in battle. The 442nd became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military, earning over 18,000 awards, including 21 Medals of Honor. The soldiers of the 442nd fought in several key campaigns in Italy, France, and Germany, including the rescue of the Lost Battalion in the Vosges Mountains of France, where they broke through German lines to rescue 211 members of the 1st Battalion, 131st Infantry Regiment, who had been surrounded by enemy forces. The contributions of Japanese American soldiers during World War II went beyond the battlefield. Their service helped to challenge stereotypes and racism against Japanese Americans, contributing to the gradual change in public perception and policy. In the post-war years, veterans of the 442nd played significant roles in advocating for civil rights and redress for the injustices of internment. The valor and loyalty of Japanese American soldiers during World War II stand as a testament to their commitment to the United States, even in the face of widespread suspicion and discrimination against their communities. Their legacy is a crucial part of the broader narrative of the Japanese American experience during the war, highlighting themes of patriotism, sacrifice, and the struggle for justice and recognition. The internment camps began to close towards the end of World War II as the U.S. government gradually acknowledged the injustice of the internment policy. The process was initiated in part by the Supreme Court's decision in Ex parte Endo from 1944, which ruled that the government could not detain a loyal American citizen without cause. Although the ruling did not directly order the closure of the camps, it set the stage for the government to begin releasing Japanese Americans from internment. In December 1944, the U.S. government announced that Japanese Americans could return to the West Coast starting in January 1945, and the process of closing the camps began. The last camp, Tule Lake Segregation Center in California, which held those who had renounced their U.S. citizenship or were deemed disloyal, was closed in March 1946. Many internees faced challenges upon their return, including finding housing and employment, as well as dealing with lingering prejudice and hostility from their former neighbors. The internment had profound long-term effects on the Japanese American community, including stigma, loss of property, and psychological impacts. Many families lost their homes, businesses, and farms during internment as they were forced to sell their properties at a fraction of their value or abandon them altogether. The economic losses were devastating and had lasting effects on the financial stability and upward mobility of Japanese American families. The stigma of having been interned lingered for decades, with many survivors reluctant to speak about their experiences due to shame or fear of discrimination. The psychological impact of internment, including trauma, anxiety, and a sense of betrayal by their government, affected not only those who were interned, but also subsequent generations. This collective trauma has been a significant aspect of the Japanese American community's history, influencing its identity and activism. The movement for redress and reparations for Japanese American internment survivors gained momentum in the 1970s and 1980s, led by Japanese American activists and supported by a broader coalition of civil rights groups, politicians, and public figures. The movement sought not only financial compensation, but also a formal apology from the U.S. government, aiming to acknowledge and rectify the injustices of the internment. This advocacy culminated in the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. The act formally apologized on behalf of the U.S. government for the grave injustice of the internment and authorized the payment of $20,000 in reparations to each surviving internee. The legislation acknowledged that the internment was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership rather than any legitimate security concerns. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was a landmark achievement for the redress movement, representing a significant step towards healing and reconciliation. It also set a precedent for the U.S. government's recognition of and compensation for historical injustices. The Act's passage was the result of decades of advocacy and activism by the Japanese American community and its allies, highlighting the importance of perseverance and collective action in the pursuit of justice. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II serves as a profound lesson on the dangers of prejudice, wartime hysteria, and the erosion of civil liberties under the guise of national security. It underscores the importance of vigilance and advocacy in upholding the rights and dignity of all individuals, especially minority communities, during times of national crisis. This dark chapter of American history reminds us that democracy and justice must be actively protected and that fear should not override the principles of fairness and equality. The relevance of these lessons continues today, as societies around the world grapple with issues of racism, xenophobia, and the balance between security and civil liberties. The internment experience teaches us the importance of critical thinking, empathy, and the courage to speak out against injustice, even when it is unpopular or difficult to do so. It also highlights the need for legal and institutional safeguards to protect the most vulnerable among us. Remembering the internment of Japanese Americans is important for several reasons. First, it serves as a powerful reminder of what can happen when fear and prejudice are allowed to override justice and humanity. By acknowledging this injustice, society can work to ensure that similar mistakes are not repeated in the future. Second, remembering this history honors the experience and resilience of the Japanese American community. It pays tribute to their suffering, their contributions to American society, and their role in fighting for redress and recognition. This acknowledgement is an essential step towards healing and reconciliation. Finally, studying this part of American history helps to foster a more informed and empathetic society. It encourages individuals to understand the complexities of history, the nuances of human behavior, and the impact of government policies on real lives. This understanding is vital in building a more inclusive and just society. To gain a deeper understanding of the internment of Japanese Americans and its lasting impact, individuals are encouraged to explore a variety of resources. 1. Visit museums. Institutions like the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles and the Manzanar National Historic Site offer insightful exhibits on the internment experience, providing personal stories, photographs, and artifacts that bring this history to life. 2. Read books. There is a wealth of literature on the internment, ranging from historical analyses to personal memoirs. Books such as Farewell to Manzanar by Jean Wakatsuki Houston and James D. Houston and No No Boy by John Okada offer perspectives on the internment and its effects on individuals and families. And 3. Engage with educational resources. Many organizations and educational institutions offer resources, including documentaries, online archives, and lesson plans that provide comprehensive information on the internment. Websites like densho.org offer extensive digital archives and oral histories that capture the experiences of Japanese Americans during World War II. By engaging with these resources, individuals can honor the memory of those affected by the internment, learn from the past, and contribute to a future where such injustices are never repeated. This engagement is not only an act of remembrance, but also a commitment to the principles of justice, equality, and human rights. In this video, we delved into the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, a critical and somber chapter in American history. We explored the historical context that led to the signing of Executive Order 9066 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, which authorized the forced relocation and internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens. We examined the conditions within the internment camps, where families lived in cramped, harsh environments, often surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. We highlighted the legal challenges to the internment, including significant Supreme Court cases like Korematsu versus United States, and discussed the valor and contributions of Japanese American soldiers, especially the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. Furthermore, we addressed the long-term effects of the internment on the Japanese American community, including the loss of property, the stigma of having been interned, and the psychological impacts. We also celebrated the efforts of the redress movement, which culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, formally apologizing and providing reparations to surviving internees. Understanding and acknowledging the internment of Japanese Americans is essential for several reasons. It serves as a reminder of the consequences of prejudice, fear, and the suspension of civil liberties. This chapter of history teaches us about the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of justice and equality. By remembering this period, we honor the experiences of those who were interned and ensure that future generations learn from these injustices. Thank you for watching this video. We hope it has provided you with a deeper understanding of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II and its lasting impact on American society. This history, though painful, is an important part of our collective memory, reminding us of the importance of protecting civil liberties and standing against injustice. If you found this content informative and valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to the Illuminating the Shadows of American History channel for more educational content. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to light and supports our mission to educate and inspire. Together, we can ensure that the lessons of the past inform our actions in the present and future. Thank you for your support and for taking the time to learn about this important aspect of American history. See you in the next video. Bye for now.